Kevin Rudd, you believe the 2020s are the decade of living dangerously for policymakers in Beijing and Washington. Why is that?
One is the balance of power continues to change in China's favour, both militarily, economically and technologically. So that shifts the dynamics of the relationship. Second reason, I think, is because Xi Jinping has his own timetable in his head for returning Taiwan to Chinese national sovereignty. Not any time soon, but my guesstimate is later 2020s, early 2030s. And then I think the final factor is we do not have as yet any effective mechanism to manage these impending crises in the US-China relationship operating.
You've identified 10 priorities for the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and number 2 is the Taiwan issue. Do you think the US and its allies are cognizant of how important that is to China?
I think there's a growing realisation of that. If you asked me 5 years ago, I don't think most would have had a clue, particularly American friends in Europe. But it's right up there next to Xi Jinping's desire for the party to remain in power and for him to be the predominant leader within the Communist Party of China. And the only thing holding them back is, one, when do they militarily really have the upper hand? And they think it's too problematic just now. They're just ahead, but not ahead far enough. And number 2 is, how do they insulate themselves against the sort of financial and economic damage that's been inflicted now on the Russians after the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Do you think China sees parallels to Taiwan in what's going on in Ukraine? And if so, what lessons is it taking from that?
There's been a little too much excited commentary in the West about China will seize on this strategic opportunity to move on Taiwan. I don't think that's the case, based on the evidence that I see on the ground. I think, though, there are a couple of things which will give the Chinese some pause for reflection within the political and military apparatus of the Chinese system. Number one is militarily invading another country or another political entity like Ukraine or Taiwan is a very difficult thing to execute. Blitzkrieg in Ukraine has failed, but it's a land-based operation. Look at Taiwan. It's an amphibious operation. There's a final factor, Lee, I think, which is they've been surprised in Beijing by the level of Western and in particular European solidarity with Ukraine and the about-face in the geopolitics of Berlin and the hardening of geopolitics in Germany and the redoubling of the defence budget is something which would also give Beijing some cause for reflection.
In a military confrontation over Taiwan between the US and China, who would win?
Now, there's a $6,000 question. In most of the wargaming which has been done so far, and these are desktop exercises by and large, if you look at what various US officials have said off the record and partly reported in the American media, the Chinese at this stage win most of the time in a wargame exercise. But there are two things now unfolding. One is that the Taiwanese, for the first time in a very long time, I think are now readdressing their national defence needs. And I think they'll be looking very carefully at the fight which the Ukrainians have put up against Russia. Secondly, the Americans are now reinvesting heavily in their military kit and equipment in East Asia and the West Pacific. So I think it really does depend, Lee, on how much more the Taiwanese and the Americans do. And with one kicker, Japan is indicating that would now see itself potentially involved. And there's a logic to that. Chinese preemptive strike would try to take out American forces probably in Guam, but also in Okinawa, and that brings Japan in.
Where does all of this position Australia?
Well, Australia is a treaty ally of the United States. So our job as a treaty ally, in my judgment, is to argue strongly and effectively with the United States two things. One is how to maximise the deterrent effect of the US military posture, but also the pan-allied military posture as well, with the Japanese, the new government in the Republic of Korea, Australia, together with our new Quad partner in India. And I think the second is this, to urge upon the Americans a stabilising mechanism for the bilateral US-China relationship, perhaps of the type that I have recommended, but I'm sure there are other variations on a theme as well, to prevent what I would describe as sleepwalking into war. And so the key thing we should also be advocating in Washington is the sort of joint strategic framework that I'm trying to talk about here, managed strategic competition, as opposed to unmanaged strategic competition, in order to create some guardrails around these strategic red lines for the future.